Plymouth Harbor, January 1944. Admiral Sir Charles Little, the commander-in-chief at Portsmouth, positioned himself by the glass of his office, observing the arrival of yet another maritime convoy entering the Sound. 18 American Liberty ships, their gray hulls sitting deep in the water under the weight of heavy cargo, their decks piled high with crates and vehicles secured beneath canvas tarpaulins. He had tallied 43 similar convoys arriving in just the preceding fortnight. Turning to face his logistics officer, he inquired about the current total of American vessels presently anchored within their jurisdiction. The officer, glancing at his clipboard, reported 217 as of the morning tally, noting that this figure excluded the landing craft still under assembly or the ships anticipated to arrive the following week. Little nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He had been orchestrating naval logistics for 30 years, had witnessed the Grand Fleet at Scapa Flow, and had overseen the evacuation from Dunkirk. He comprehended naval operations on a magnitude that few could fathom. Yet this situation was entirely unprecedented. The Americans were not merely contributing to an invasion fleet. They were constructing one from the ground up on British soil at a velocity that appeared physically implausible. The initial American vessels had reached Britain for Operation Overlord planning during the latter part of 1943. These were small detachments initially, consisting of a few destroyers and some transports, representing the vanguard of what would eventually constitute the Western Naval Task Force under the command of Rear Admiral Alan Kirk. British planners had analyzed the figures, understood the depth of the American commitment, and sanctioned the allocations. However, comprehending numbers on a ledger and witnessing those figures manifest physically in one's own harbors were two distinct realities. By February, the steady stream had transformed into a deluge. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for Operation Neptune, maintained his headquarters at Southwick House near Portsmouth. As a fastidious strategist, Ramsay had masterminded the Dunkirk evacuation and possessed a grasp of complex naval maneuvers superior to almost any living commander. He had spent months in coordination with his American peers, scrutinizing ship allotments and plotting the elaborate choreography for the most massive amphibious assault in recorded history. The strategy required nearly 7,000 vessels in total, with the Americans slated to supply roughly 3,000 of them. 3,000 vessels. Ramsay had inscribed that figure innumerable times in dossiers and planning schemas, had debated it in conferences with Eisenhower and Montgomery, and had coordinated with Admiral Kirk regarding their deployment and structure. Yet, observing their actual arrival, day after day, week after week, fostered a different level of realization. In early March, Ramsay stood upon the deck of HMS Largs, his command ship, as an American convoy navigated into the Solent. Through his binoculars, he enumerated the vessels. 22 LSTs, landing ship, tank, each possessing the capacity to transport 20 Sherman tanks or 33 trucks. Their flat-bottomed hulls and bow ramps rendered them awkward in turbulent waters, but they held the capability to run aground, offload their cargo directly onto the sand, and then withdraw to retrieve more. Following the LSTs was a procession of smaller amphibious vessels, LCILs, Landing Craft Infantry Large, each engineered to ferry 200 soldiers directly to the shoreline. Ramsay counted 34 of them within this single convoy. His flag lieutenant approached to report that the convoy manifest indicated 41 additional LSTs were scheduled to dock at Plymouth the following day, with another convoy of 67 LCIs arriving the day after that. Ramsay lowered his binoculars, and asked where they intended to place them all. The reports from Plymouth indicated they were anchoring in lines stretching 3 miles into the Sound, while Falmouth was so densely packed that the harbor master claimed one could traverse the entire harbor by walking from ship to ship. This was no hyperbole. British port commanders were dispatching increasingly frantic missives regarding the lack of space. The southern coastline of England had effectively become a colossal naval parking lot, with American vessels occupying every available anchorage, every harbor, and every inlet with sufficient depth to float a hull. Furthermore, the Americans were importing their own port infrastructure. In April, British engineers observed with professional intrigue as American Seabees, construction battalions, assembled floating piers at Portland. These were not makeshift docks. They were engineered structures prefabricated in America, transported in sections, and assembled with an industrial efficiency that left the British engineers astounded. Commander Edward Gurritz, a British liaison officer assigned to the American forces, noted in his diary that the Americans had arrived with sufficient concrete and steel to construct a small metropolis, remarking that they were not adapting to British ports, but rather constructing their own. The magnitude became impossible to disregard. By late April, British civilians residing along the southern coast discovered their familiar vistas had been transfigured. Harbors they had known all their lives, where they could once count the boats and name half the captains, had become dense forests of masts and superstructures. The ocean itself appeared to have vanished beneath a carpet of steel hulls. A fisherman from Weymouth, barred from taking his vessel out due to wartime restrictions, stood on the harbor wall and tallied American ships until he reached 300, at which point he ceased counting. He told a journalist that in 40 years of fishing those waters, he had never witnessed anything comparable. The water was gone, replaced by ships as far as the eye could see. The American contribution was defined not merely by quantity, but by the specific types of vessels, which revealed the sophistication of American industrial planning. Admiral Sir Philip Vian, commanding the Eastern Task Force, toured the American anchorages in early May. His British forces were tasked with assaulting Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, while the Americans were assigned Utah and Omaha. He needed to comprehend the capabilities his American counterparts were introducing. At Plymouth, he boarded the USS Nevada, a battleship that had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, salvaged, repaired, and navigated across the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, and across the Atlantic to support the invasion. Her 14-inch guns could propel a shell weighing 1,400 pounds more than 20 miles inland. The American liaison officer explained she was one of 3 battleships they were contributing, with the Texas and Arkansas positioned at Portland, alongside 3 heavy cruisers, 7 light cruisers, and 34 destroyers assigned solely to the Western Task Force. Vian performed the mental calculation and realized the Americans were bringing more heavy naval gunfire support to their 2 beaches than the entire Royal Navy had available for the 3 British sectors. Yet, while the battleships and cruisers were formidable, they were not the elements that made the invasion feasible. The landing craft were. By late May, the final tallies were becoming evident. The Americans had delivered more than 2,000 landing craft of diverse categories: LSTs, LCIs, LCTs, landing craft, tank, each category featuring sub-variants designed for specific tactical functions. The LST-2s could transport 60 troops and 9 Sherman tanks, or 150 tons of cargo. They could traverse the Atlantic under their own power, ground themselves on D-Day, discharge their payload, retract, and return to England. The Americans had constructed over 1,000 of these, and hundreds were now jammed into British harbors. The LCVPs, Landing Craft Vehicle Personnel, the small Higgins boats destined to ferry troops to the sands, numbered in the thousands. Each could hold 36 men or a jeep with its crew. They hung from davits on larger transport ships, ready to be lowered into the sea. British officers who had served in the Mediterranean and witnessed prior amphibious operations grasped the significance. At Sicily and Salerno, shortages of landing craft had constrained operations, necessitating compromises. For Overlord, there would be no deficit. Captain John Hughes Hallett, a British naval officer involved in planning since the earliest stages, stood on a hill overlooking Weymouth Bay in late May. The harbor below contained more than 400 vessels. Beyond them, anchored in rows stretching to the horizon, hundreds more awaited. He remarked to a colleague that in every previous planning session, the persistent question had been whether they possessed sufficient landing craft. The Americans simply continued to build them. His colleague, a veteran of the Dieppe raid planning 2 years prior, nodded slowly. At Dieppe, they had scraped together enough craft for 5,000 men, and the raid had been a disaster. Now, gazing at the fleet below, they were preparing to land 156,000 men on the first day alone. The volume of American production was one factor. The velocity was another.
British industry had been on a war footing since 1939, enduring 5 years of rationing, conscription, bombing, and total mobilization. British shipyards were constructing vessels as rapidly as possible, but they were simultaneously repairing battle damage and contending with material scarcity. American industry had accelerated in half that time and was outproducing Britain by margins that seemed impossible. A British Admiralty logistics officer reviewing production statistics recalculated 3 times to ensure he had not committed an error. In 1943 alone, American shipyards had launched more than 2,000 landing craft. In a single year, they had constructed more specialized amphibious vessels than Britain had built during the entire war. The Liberty ships were being finalized at a rate of 3 per day across all American shipyards. Some yards were launching a completed vessel every 4 days from a single slipway. A British officer observed that they were not building ships, they were manufacturing them. The distinction was more than semantic. American shipyards had adopted assembly line techniques and prefabrication methods that British yards could not replicate. The result was visible in every British port by late May 1944. Admiral Ramsay convened his final planning conference on May 28th. More than 100 senior officers packed into the room at Southwick House. Ramsay stood before a colossal map displaying the English Channel and the Normandy coast. Colored pins denoted the positions of task forces and minesweeper lanes. He announced the final count: 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft, 736 ancillary vessels, and 864 merchant ships. He paused, allowing the figures to resonate. Of these, the American contribution was approximately 3,000 vessels. The room fell silent. Every officer present understood logistics. They knew these numbers represented the industrial capacity of an entire nation focused on a singular objective. Admiral Sir Harold Burrough noted that the last time England assembled a fleet of this magnitude was to defend against the Armada, not to launch one. Ramsay corrected him, stating that a fleet of this size had never been assembled before. In the days preceding D-Day, British officers conducted final tours of their sectors. From Portland Bill looking west, the sea was a solid mass of ships. From Portsmouth looking east, the vista was identical. On June 3rd, with the invasion imminent, a convoy of 47 American LSTs entered Plymouth Sound. The harbormaster, awake for 36 hours, stared at his chart. There was no remaining space. He ordered them to anchor in a line extending out to sea, creating a floating pier stretching nearly 2 miles. The Americans complied, having parked their ships wherever space allowed for months. British troops boarding their vessels in early June walked past American ships for hundreds of yards. A British sergeant remarked to his corporal that the Yanks had truly brought everyone. On June 4th, Eisenhower postponed the invasion for 24 hours due to weather. 6,939 vessels waited. British port commanders faced the challenge of supplying this massive fleet for an extra day. The Americans, however, had anticipated this. Their logistics ships were already positioned. When British commanders requested supplies, American officers pointed to their manifests. They had brought enough for delays and contingencies. A British supply officer observed that the Americans thought in terms of abundance, bringing twice what was needed, whereas the British thought in terms of scarcity. On June 5th, the weather improved, and Eisenhower gave the order. Operation Overlord was active. The fleet began to move. British officers watching from the shore witnessed a spectacle that would remain with them forever. 6,939 vessels, organized into 5 task forces, began moving south. The American Western Task Force, under Admiral Kirk, moved first from the western ports. Behind them, the transports carrying troops for Utah and Omaha beaches followed. From the eastern ports, British and Canadian forces moved simultaneously. The channel became a highway of ships organized into lanes. Minesweepers led the way, clearing 10 channels. Admiral Ramsay watched from HMS Largs, acknowledging that the Americans had made this possible, as Britain could never have built such a fleet in time. A British destroyer commander, escorting American LSTs, counted the vessels until he reached 100 and stopped, his navigation officer remarking that in 16 years of service he had never seen anything like it. By dawn on June 6th, the fleet was in position. At 0550 hours, the bombardment ships opened fire. Nevada, Texas, and Arkansas hammered German positions. The landing craft went in at 0630 hours. At Utah Beach, the landing was overwhelming. At Omaha, despite fierce resistance, the sheer number of vessels ensured that troops and supplies kept coming. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 Allied troops were ashore. In the ensuing weeks, the fleet continued its work. By the end of June, over 850,000 troops and 570,000 tons of supplies had landed. Admiral Ramsay, in his final report, stated clearly that the American contribution of approximately 3,000 vessels was essential to achieving the required scale. British officers were even more direct in private, noting that seeing thousands of ships built in the last 2 years was the moment they understood the true meaning of American industrial power. The fleet that filled British harbors in the spring of 1944 represented a fundamental shift. It was the difference between fighting with limited resources and applying overwhelming material superiority. British commanders realized that they had asked for an invasion fleet, and the Americans had delivered an armada that dwarfed historical precedents. They understood, watching those ships fill the horizon, that this overwhelming force was how the war would finally be won.